In this lecture, we're going to look at Genesis chapter 2 and 3, the Adam and Eve story in the Garden of Eden. First thing to note is that the literary genre of this story is very different than what we saw in Genesis 1. In Genesis 1, as we talked about in the last lecture, trying to give a realistic portrayal of the world that we inhabit. While it's not trying to be scientific, it is trying to describe the natural world and phenomena around it in terms that would make sense, that would correlate to our own experience. In contrast, the Garden of Eden story is about a world that we don't know. We've never been there. We know we've never been there because at the end of the story we're told that the whole garden is protected by this mythological creature called the cherubim. It has a flaming sword that turns in all directions. And we know these kinds of figures because we oftentimes uncover them in archaeology. These are composite beings, usually represented with wings of eagles, and then they have ox and lion components as well as human elements as well. And they're put in front of throne rooms to protect the king from danger. In fact, they're also used to protect holy sites. We have a similar figure described in the Bible protecting the Ark of the Covenant, that in the temple, in the Holy of Holies, in the first temple period, there were these figures that protected the Ark of the Covenant where the tablets of the Ten Commandments were placed. Further, we have examples of them being engraved into thrones themselves, so that the king's own throne would consist of these winged beings that protected the area. If you want to get a sense of these figurines, you can go down to the University of Chicago, and to their Oriental Museum. It's well worth the trip. A lot of marvelous artifacts there from the ancient Near East, including Israel. And here we see some of the bas reliefs that they took out of the Nineveh, the throne room of Nineveh, and you can see one of these figures in that tradition. They're not called cherubim, but lamasus, and standing by that, you're just dwarfed. You can see how this could be an intimidating figure. Contrast that to our little cherubim in our modern world context in the upper left-hand corner, those chubby, cheeked, angelic figures that we have. That usually when we hear the word cherubim, that's what we think of. So before we leave our discussion about cherubim, we need to rough these guys up a bit, so a little more intimidating, like their ancient Near East forebears. So let's do that. All right, now they're a little more in line with the ancient Near East traditions. Another way we know that this land that is being described in Genesis 2 and 3 is not like ours is the fact that the land is watered. Notice in chapter 2, verse 6, it says that a stream would well up upon the earth and water all the ground. Well, I think that's your first example of an underground lawn sprinkler system, because that's not how we know how the world's watered. The natural way for the world to be watered is from above, that we inhabit. It's through rain. So again, this is a world we don't know, and that's very important because this tells us that the literary genre is distinct from what we saw in Genesis 1. There's some technical terms we could use for this, but I think the ones that's going to be most helpful, the title we could give this would be science fiction. Now, that's not an ancient Near Eastern term, but obviously it is a modern one, and it gives us a sense of what this type of literature is trying to do. Science fiction is about a world that we don't know, and yet by telling the story of an unknown world, it can explore human experience in very poignant and provocative ways. I mean, think about the classic Star Wars TV shows from the 1960s. They could talk about racial relationships in the 60s in a much more profound way than even a documentary could. Since we don't have anything invested in an extraterrestrial world, we are more open to seeing the truth about the absurdity of prejudice that's occurring between two fictitious races in space. Well, so Genesis 2 and 3 is something like science fiction, except it's more like Star Wars because it takes place in the past, not the future. If you remember the Star Wars opening credits. We're told this happened in the past. Now, interestingly, Genesis 2 and 3, even though it comes after Genesis 1, is probably the older creation story. It was probably communicated orally for a long time, but it was written down during the divided kingdom phase. Some people would even date it back here in the United Kingdom historical period. But it's in this period. It's called the pre-exilic period. And remember, Genesis 1 is written during the exilic period. So, with that in mind, let's move to unpacking this story, and let's focus first on one key verse, chapter 2, verse 7. The Lord God formed the human, Adam is the word there, out of clay of the earth, of the ground, and blew into his nostrils the breath of life, so that that human being became a living being. This is really a linchpin verse, and we can unpack kind of the focus of this chapter 2 in many ways through this verse. Couple points. Point 1. This story tells us that we humans are what I would call inspired earthlings. I mean, this is actually a pretty funny little line here. We don't get the humor because we don't get the puns in Hebrew. But there's a play on word here, because the word Adam sounds very similar to another Hebrew word, Adom. And Adom means earth. So maybe in keeping with my point, we should read Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 much like we read science fiction. We should translate Adam in verse 7 as earthling. That would work, that sort of genre of science fiction. Because the human is made out of the earth. This pun is about the human and the earth are being quite similar, not only in terms of etymological origins of the word human, but also because they're of our nature. And we see the same sense in English, where we have the word human, which comes from the word humus, which again, humus would be dirt. Okay, so notice that God takes the human being, forms him out of the clay of the earth, and then blows into his nostril. He ruahs. That's the word for breath, the same word that we saw in Genesis chapter 1, where we saw the wind or the breath of God or Spirit blowing across the waters. Interesting enough, we have the same ruah word. So here we see that God ruahs into the human's nostrils, so he's sharing with human this breath of God, and it gives him life. God does not ruah into the animals' nostrils to give them life, only humans. So this text sees us humans as having a dual nature of being animated by the Spirit of God and yet being material as well. So you could say the story is telling us we're both material and spiritual. Another point to be made before we leave the discussion about being the human beings is that while many translations translate the word Adam as Adam or man as man, because later on Adam becomes the name for the man, here I think we have to, if we're going to be fair to the text, it can mean both male and female, because it's the human being, it's the person, it does not genderize at this point. Well, just like in English, man can be a generic for both men and women. It can also refer to the male gender exclusively. Well, this text, it seems like we should understand as being inclusive of both male and female, because later on we're going to hear about how God pulls a rib out of the Adam, and then at that point the text says that Ish and Isha, that's male-female, those are translations for those two words. Ish and Isha, he created them. So at that point you have gender differentiation, but not here in verse 7. That comes later in verses 21 to 23. All right. So the other points that this verse brings out is that God is portrayed like a potter. While Genesis 1, God is rather transcendent, here he simply takes, instead of using words like he did in Genesis 1, here he takes his hands and crafts the human person. So the portrayal of God is very different in Genesis 2. this God is much more tangible, anthropomorphic. The word formed in verse 7 gives the impression of God's molding us with his hands with clay. You can almost picture God sitting in the dirt and stretching and pushing the clay into the figure of the human being and then doing a little mouth-to-mouth resuscitation to give it life. So this anthropomorphic portrayal becomes clearer later on in the story when Adam and Eve say they heard God walking in the garden, which implies that God has some sort of mass to him, if you will. At least he's making some sound in some manner. So this is a very distinct portrayal of God in Genesis 2 compared to Genesis 1. Another way that this is somewhat distinct from Genesis 1's portrayal is that while Genesis 1 had a cosmic, transcendent God, and certainly God is transcendent, in this version of the story, he's much more human. And this says something because it's hard to love a disembodied concept, some amorphous cosmic force. But here in Genesis 2, we have a God who's more like a parent. Just as each of us were knitted in our mother's wombs, this God forms us with his very hands. And just like a loving parent, even God attempts to help us in ways that are not initially successful. But he journeys with us, trying to mold us to the person that God dreams for us to be. So, for example, after God created the human person, he says in verse 18 that he will make a suitable partner for the earthling, for the human being. And then God creates the animals of the world, which the human names. But the text says in verse 20 that these animals did not prove to be a suitable helpmate. So God is then portrayed of trying a different way to create this suitable helpmate. And what does he do? That's where he takes the rib out. And I think we as parents can relate to this, that we have to journey with our children to lead them to the fullness that we desire for them and for those relationships with others that we desire for them. So God puts Adam into a sleep and pulls out the rib, and that's where we get the distinction between Isha and Ish, female and male. All right. So what we see is this God is a little different than the one we have portrayed in Genesis 1. Well, let's move forward then to the third chapter, where we really get into the classic story of Adam and Eve in the garden and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In order to be able to interpret this story, we have to identify the key character. Now, who might that be? Eve? Adam? God? All those are good guesses, but no, I don't think they're right. The key character, I think, that's going to help us decipher this story is the snake. That may be surprising. After all, the snake's the villain of the story. And that's true, but that's exactly why he's such a key character. For you see, snakes were central to the religion of the Syrian culture, Israel's neighbor to the north and east. Much as in the case in Genesis 1, this story of Genesis 3 is best understood in relationship to their neighbor's mythology. So let's take a look at the Syrian creation story. So here's a map trying to indicate where we see Syria, which is up in this area just to the north. We have Phoenicians along the coast and then Syrians to the northern border. Similar to the Babylonian creation story, the Syrian creation story is a combat myth that involves a battle between life and death. In their religion, there were two main gods, Baal and Anat, sometimes called Asherah. And in fact, what the figurines I give you here, the figure on the left is Baal. He was a storm god, as you can see, with his thunderbolt that he holds in his left hand. Then you have Anat, or as I said, sometimes in biblical tradition she's described as Asherah. And she's the goddess of earth or soil. And if you take a look at this, these are called pillar figurines, and clearly emphasizing that the life-giving nature of this goddess. And even the figure, notice the feet. how it spreads out there. These are pillar figurines. Many biblical scholars note that these figures, this figure looks like a tree, to emphasize her role in agriculture. That's why it flares out. They certainly could make feet, so he didn't have to make the figure this way. So it captures her role within the divine realm of perpetuating agriculture. She's tied to the ground that she's the god of. So what's the myth? The myth is that they believed that when Baal sent the rain and the lightning bolts, that brought forth life. Well, certainly it does, and it's not hard to see why you depict that as in sort of sexual imagery of the rain coming down and bringing forth the crops. Now, there were other gods within the firmament of the Syrian religion, and the main other god would be Moat, the god of death. Literally, the word Moat means death. And Moat had these two helpers, Leviathan, who was a sea dragon, interesting, sort of like what we saw there with Tiamat, and also the god of, like Tiamat, the god of chaos, and then Yam, who is the god of the sea. So, and Yam literally means sea. So again, we see these parallels with the Enuma Elish, seeing the water, particularly the salt water, the seas being the place of chaos. Now, according to this creation myth, Baal and Moat battled. And Moat killed Baal. And then, in revenge, kills Moat, kills death, which brought Baal back to life. However, the story doesn't end there. Instead, it repeats itself as Baal and Moat battle again, Baal dies, and it kills Moat, Baal comes back to life. Over and over again, the story says, this eternal battle raged. Clearly you see in this repetitive cycle nature's seasons. So this story itself explains why is it. It's an etymology, or I'm sorry, in teleology. It explains why do we have seasons. Because the gods are battling up in the heavens. And it's not surprising that this myth might reflect the seasons, because this is an agricultural religion. And these gods, Baal and Aneth, are responsible for the perpetuation of the life cycle of the seasons within their own lives. But notice what the story says. It says that the creation is not an event, but an endless cycle that just repeats itself over and over again. And even the gods, much less us, are trapped in that cycle. There's no free decision or free will in that cycle of creation. Okay, key point, because as we turn to the snake. Now, snakes were central symbols of the Syrian faith as they were associated with their fertility rituals. Here you see a plaque, a gold plaque, in fact, from the 14th, 13th centuries, dug up in Syria, Ugarit, so that's in Syria. And we have, again, a nude fertility goddess. It's probably Aneth. In fact, it has all the characteristics of Aneth. But notice she's flanked by snakes. She's holding these snakes. Okay. And so clearly from this iconographic data and other sources, snakes were seen as representing sexual activity. So hence, when a snake shows up in a Hebrew story, all about the world's origins and about naked men and women who are threatened by death, then you just know that that snake's just not any old snake. It's a clue to understanding and unlocking what the author is trying to say. So if we envision the story to be like a combination lock, then the first number we got to spin the dial to is the snake's presence, which is a clear sign that the Syrian combat myth is providing some sort of background to this story. The second number we spin this combination to is that the snakes were also archetypal figures of life and death. Archetypal figures of life and death within this culture and many cultures. And think about it. Snakes are feared because they're able to kill us with their venom. Now, I understand when a lion tears out my innards and I die, But why do I die when a snake simply gives me a little bite? I just saw on the internet that a triathlete died, Ironman triathlete died when a snake bit it. Here's a person of full vitality, and this little being just gives you a bite. How is that possible? Such mysterious power for such a little creature. And further, this creature sheds its skin. It seems to be almost immortal because it seems to continually regenerate itself. So there's real reasons why snakes seem to take on within the culture, many cultures, this sense of being an archetype for life and death and immortality. And again, that's the figure we have within Genesis 2 and 3. Genesis 3, which is a story about two people who eat from the knowledge of good and evil, but don't get a chance to eat from the tree of life. And in fact, we're explicitly told they're sent out of the garden because God fears that they'll eat from the tree of life. That will give them eternal life. Okay, so now let's take a look at the snake here, because it's an interesting to notice in the story that in fact this snake tells Adam and Eve the truth. That's right, I said the truth. The snake asked Eve, "What will happen if you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil?" Eve answers that she will die the death. The Hebrew text is usually translated something like "you will surely die" or "just die," but in the Hebrew text it says "mot mot," literally death death, or die die. That expression, mot mot, in the ancient Near Eastern cultures meant execution. You will be executed. In response, the snake says, "No, you will not be executed. Instead, your eyes will be open and you'll be like the gods, knowing the difference between good and evil." By the way, good and evil here is an merism. Merism takes two opposites to indicate the boundaries of something. So, for example, we often say, "He knows everything from A to Z," by which we mean the person just doesn't know everything about A and everything about Z, but also everything in between, about B, C, D, E, F, etc. Everything between A and Z. Well, that's a merism. So likewise, a knowledge of good and evil, the two greatest extremes in human experience, means that eating of this tree is not just about moral knowledge, but all knowledge, knowledge of everything. Well, in fact, Adam and Eve aren't immediately killed, but it will die a natural death years after being expelled from the garden. Further, their eyes are open, for right after they eat the tree, the fruit of the tree, they recognize they are naked and they clothe themselves. This signifies that they now know the difference between good and evil. They have knowledge of the world. And this is even verified by God, when God states that he is expelling them from the garden because they are, quote, "like us in all things, knowing good and evil," unquote. Since they have this knowledge, God fears that they will now eat from the tree of life, the second tree in the garden. If they do so, they will be immortal like the gods. All right. So, what's the point of the story? The snake has helped us understand that as an archetypal figure representing life and death, that there's something key about the role of the snake. And what does the snake inform Adam and Eve? Well, that by eating the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they become self-aware. That's the point about being shamed about being naked. They're self-aware. They have a new sense of who they are. What are they aware of? Well, they become aware that they are going to die. That's why God's afraid they're going to eat the tree of life. They have aware of their mortality. And it is this mortality that binds us to the lots of animals. Animals also die. And at the same time, we're fundamentally different than the animals. We put on clothing while the animals don't. We have to struggle to scratch out our living while animals simply stumble across free food in nature. We painfully labor in childbirth while the animals seem to give birth effortlessly. All right, so we humans are somehow stuck between the animals, We share some things with them, but some things not. And further, the greatest difference is that we have knowledge, wisdom, intelligence. Specifically, we know two things. First, we are aware that we have a past. We know about those who existed before us, while animals have no consciousness about their grandparents or great-grandparents. They have no sense of history, or only instinct. But we do. We have this historical consciousness, and it's a powerful tool in developing as a species. Secondly, we know about our future. We can imagine the future. We can act towards the future. We can create the future. Animals can't. However, that's a two-edged sword, knowing about the future. It also makes us aware that we will not live forever, that we will die. That is the future we can see. So therefore, we're stuck between the gods who, because we have this consciousness, this awareness like the gods, and yet we also have the fate of the animals who are going to die. The snake, the figure of life and death, leads the human to eat of the knowledge of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the result is that we have this divine knowledge, which is only known by God and humans. So the story is basically about our human self-awareness, how we're stuck between the transitory animal world and the everlasting divine existence. However, the snake has another function. It brings to mind the Syrian creation myth of the neighbors, in contrast to those creation myths in which gods and humans are trapped in an endless cycle. Genesis 3 wants to say that because of this self-awareness comes free will, the power to make choices and decisions, the ability to change the pattern. So we're not a victim of fate, but have a role in determining our future through our actions. That freedom is a divine power, and it confirms that part of that is it gives us the freedom to love. It's a divine power to love, and we know God loves us because, notice, like a parent, he takes care of Adam and Eve. He gives them clothes, and he doesn't execute them. Like a parent, we can threaten, if you don't do X, then X is going to happen, Y is going to happen, and then in fact we don't do Y, we do Z. So that's out of love. And so we see that God is portrayed in this parental means, this parental sort of fashion. And we'll see that a couple times in Genesis. God will pull back from his hard line from time to time and show mercy. But love is only possible with the power of that free will. Without it, expressions of care and concern for others is simply animal instinct, not divine choice. So this story is saying something rather powerful about what human beings have the capacity for. We can share in that divine love. So this parental God certainly punishes us for our mistakes and is prudent enough to guard the entrance of the Garden of Eden with that cherubim. It's 1/2 lion, 1/4 human, and 1/4 eagle. So we don't get to that tree of life. Now, in our Christian context, we do get access to that tree of life when Jesus is hung upon it. But in this story, we are removed from the tree of life. However, God is still portrayed as caring for us, protecting us, guiding us. Maybe that is because we have a God's breath in us, His Spirit within us, the Ruah of God, and animals don't. So now, here's a question for you. 2 questions, in fact. Why do we have 2 stories of creation which provide different theologies of God, the world, human nature, and morality? One, Genesis 1, is very positive, very affirming about the goodness of life. Every time God makes something, He says it's good, it's tov, it works, it's sufficient. And humans are the instruments of God's plan for maintaining this goodness. Yet God's very cosmic, very transcendent. He creates just through words. And then we have another portrayal of God in Genesis 2 and 3. God is more human-like, more anthropomorphic, has a little more limited powers, isn't quite perfect in some ways. It has to try a couple times to get us a suitable helpmate. More parental. Likewise, humans are portrayed more ambiguously, and Genesis 2 and 3. We have a dual nature, both earthly and spiritual. We're rebellious because we're conflicted and dissatisfied about our place in the world. And the world is a place of suffering and toil in some ways. These are very different visions of God in the world. So why are they both here in the Bible? And then a second question. How does the fact that we have two different creation stories in the Bible give insight on how we evangelize and heal a fractured world? We're watching this video in preparation for Saturday's class, but we're going to discuss these two questions on Monday's class, so you have some time to think about those. All right, thank you very much. We'll see you on Saturday.